I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at the latest tactical and strategic updates from the ground, explore the Russian and Ukrainian positions in the negotiations that have started in Turkey, and we look at the role of espionage in the conflict.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 34, and today I'm joined by Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, and Francis Durnley, our Assistant Comment Editor. To start, I asked Dom to update us with the latest news from the ground.
Hi, David. Hi, everybody. Again, a fairly static day across the theatre of Ukraine. There has been news that Irpin, the region of Kyiv capital, just to the northwest of the city centre, has been retaken. An American journalist who's based in Ukraine, Nolan Peterson, said that Alpha One, which is what Ukraine is calling its Foreign Legion team of people from all around the world, including American volunteers, took part in that action there. Elsewhere, there's been an attack on a government building in Mykolaiv, down in the south, which has killed a small number of people, and others are still unaccounted for. And other than that, the focus seems to be still with Mariupol, which is clinging on desperately. And in the east, there's been reports that the Wagner Group and mercenaries are moving into the Donbass. However, there's also footage showing Russia, and it's thought to be this group, using a Toyota Hilux trucks, the old technicals as we'd call them, with heavy machine guns on the back, which is very interesting. If a month into this war, Russia has lost so much equipment that they're having to rely on modified civilian vehicles. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. But yeah, in terms of tactical action, that's the update. There's been quite a lot on the diplomatic front, but we'll come on to that in just a minute.
Definitely. There's just been some news just come in. We've just retopped our live blog with it. That I'll just read it for you now. Russia's main aim in Ukraine is now the, quote, liberation, end quote, of the eastern Donbass region, the Kremlin has said, confirming an apparent scaling back of invasion plans. Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, claimed the main targets of the first stage of the operation have been reached. How do we react to that? Is this proof that really they haven't got what they wanted and they're now trying to find a way to say they've won?
Yeah, I think it's along that road. I mean, Sergei Shoigu, who hasn't been seen for a couple of weeks, there was speculation. Well, a load of speculation. There's no point in repeating it here, but he's now back on the stage. He said that Ukrainian military had been, quote, seriously degraded, which, if you remember, was one of the other things that they said they needed to not wear down, but to reduce the military capacity of Ukraine. So we're seeing this slow erosion back from what Putin and the Russian leadership, very boldly claimed as the purpose of the war in the first instance. I mean, we'll talk in a minute about the peace talks and negotiations in Turkey. But one of the things that's happened there is that Russia has dropped the call for denazification. So they've dropped the denazification. They've said the Ukrainian military has been seriously worn down. Zelensky has said that he's willing to talk, albeit with caveats about referendum and so on, about NATO membership and security guarantees. And then we got this focus on the Donbass. So yeah, I think Russia realizes it's got to get out of this, and it's got to find some kind of way of downgrading what it originally said it would go in for, some way of turning it into proclaiming a victory. I think you're seeing some fairly sensible, pragmatic noises from Ukraine to allow them this victory, if they want to call it a victory. Fine. So we are moving that way. Of course, nothing about the drug dealers. Sounds like Russia's perfectly happy to leave this sort of roaming band of drug dealers in charge of Ukraine, but then maybe they'll pick that one up tomorrow.
Francis, do you want to come in on this? Thanks so much, Dom.
Yes, well, whilst they haven't made reference to the denazification, they've still talked about liberating the Donbass, which one can obviously read in slightly different ways. I mean, it is fascinating, isn't it, that this was started clearly as a whole-scale invasion of Ukraine. As we've talked about many times, Putin laid out in his essay back in July that it was very clear that he sought to reabsorb Ukraine as part of some greater Russian Empire or former Soviet Union, if however you want to articulate that, and he has not succeeded. So this is major estimation management on the part of the Russian regime now, attempting to claim that all along it only sought to retake the Donbass. Now, I know we're going to come on to negotiations later on, but it's really important, I think, to understand that this may not be as simple as us thinking, well, of course, Ukraine are not going to concede any ground to the Russians and are now going to go for total victory. Because actually there is an argument that it will be beneficial to Ukraine's stability in the long run to give Russia some of this territory that has already been occupied by its troops, and also that already has a largely sympathetic Russian population, that this may actually be seen as a benefit to the stabilization of President Zelensky's country. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, because I think there's huge dangers of giving any ground to a monster like Putin, who conducts an illegal war such as this and is perceived as getting away with it with some beneficial gain. I think that's incredibly dangerous, which is why the West is telling Zelensky, so we hear, not to give in on any ground in negotiations. But that may not be the way that President Zelensky sees it, and I think that will be when we talk about negotiations, that will be one of the interesting things to discuss. But certainly, just to Dom's point, militarily, this is obviously a huge conceding of the initial objectives of the Russian operation. And I think we should be very clear about that, and not buy the Russian propaganda line that this was somehow their intention all along, because it clearly wasn't. And I just conclude by saying the point that I made yesterday at the end of yesterday's podcast, which is, imagine how you would feel if you were fighting around Kiev or in some of these other regions that were being so fiercely attacked by Russian soldiers in recent weeks, and you're now told that operation was essentially never really of immense strategic value in the grand scheme of things. I mean, it would be to say it would be damaging to morale would be an understatement. Imagine as well in Russia if you'd lost your son, a conscript, in a battle around Kyiv, which now is no longer a military target. So this is a significant moment, I think.
Thanks, Francis. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about Joe Biden and his diplomacy. We saw an update on that story today where he said he made no apologies for calling for Vladimir Putin's removal, but claimed he was expressing his personal feelings, not a new US policy, as he defended his off-the-cuff remark. This is the remark where he said, this guy can't stay in power. I just wanted to hear both of your reactions to that. And then I've got a question from a listener as well.
I think obviously it's asking a lot of the people of the free world to say, oh, don't take what I said seriously as President of the United States, that I was speaking in a personal capacity and not talking about US foreign policy. I think it's asking rather a lot there, really, and it's clearly a climb down further from what was where we were yesterday, when we had to have a rather embarrassing White House denial immediately after the remarks were made. So I think we whatever whilst obviously he is articulating what many people feel here, as we talked about at length yesterday, I think there are a lot of risks attached to that, and I don't think we can see this as anything more than a rather a red-faced president.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think he should just be quiet about this whole thing now. He's not going to be able to draw back the... I'm still sticking with the line that I think it was a gift to Putin. He's not going to be able to pull that back. And what he's doing now is just muddying the waters so that we, the public who in other nations, listen to him. And as Francis says, are we now to to think, hang on, is he speaking as the president or is he speaking as Joe? And it's just really unhelpful. Clarity of language is very important when you're in a leadership position such as he is. I think he made a mistake the other day. Okay, fine, we'll do that. I think he should just stop now and not keep drawing attention to it, because it's just making it worse.
Thanks both. So just quickly, this I thought was a very interesting question from a listener, from Justin. And just to say, if you do have questions from us, please do email, please do DM us. We want to hear them. So the question is this, just on this topic, quote, "The conversation in the podcast group seems to be very worried about Russian propaganda using these remarks for their gain." This is President Biden's remarks. "But so what? Do we really think the Russian public is on the fence about Putin? It's a cruder form of power to say something like this, but it may have the effect of actually getting through to Putin that he is the problem." Just quickly, what are your reactions to that?
Well, firstly, thanks, Justin, for getting in touch. It's an absolutely valid point. No, I don't think the Russian public are on the fence, and I would have thought far fewer, a very small number would. I've really mangled that sentence, haven't I? I'm sorry, but I wouldn't have thought many people would get a great deal of information from the state about this anyway. So I don't think it would sway a huge number of people in Russia. However, just taking a step back from that, there are still a huge number of floating voters here internationally who could really impact the situation. And I've posited before that I can see a role for the CSTO, the sort of what Russia would like to style as the kind of equivalent to NATO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is basically Russia 90%, and then Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So this group that went into Kazakhstan a few months ago, you may remember, albeit it might have been 99% Russian troops. So I think there's a role for the CSTO in the Donbass. This might be where we're going. Some kind of quote unquote peacekeeping force that's not Russian. It might be Russian in Armenian uniforms, but not Russian, CSTO. And I think all these things, and I stick with the line gaffe. I think it was a gaffe by Biden. I think this is just going to be used by Putin to sway countries such as those to say, look, we need to stand up against the West, against NATO. This is the plan, not just his domestic audience, for whom Putin will find this incredibly useful.
If I could just add to that, I agree with what Dom has said. Thanks for getting in touch, Justin. Always nice to have somebody to debate with other than David and Dom. But yes, so I'd say three things in response. The first is we talked before about the Russian mentality, and part of that is fearing attack, first of all, which I know may seem alien to many of us, but fear of a hostile invasion, which of course the Russian state has faced numerous times in the 20th century. Fear of Western influence seeking to destabilize and ultimately undermine the Russian state. So any talk at all about regime change plays into this cultural, deeply rooted psychological fear of Western meddling in Russian affairs. And so that's why I think it's not helpful. I think that's the first reason. The second reason I think that it's an issue is it appears clearly very weak when you are trying to put forward a united front internationally about reacting to Putin, and then your own White House has to deny what the remarks that you've just said, and then you yourself rowing back essentially in the subsequent hours. It's not a good look when you're trying to be a strong figurehead. And lastly, I think it just underlines this point again that we've made several times on this podcast in the last few weeks, that it makes it very easy for Putin and for the West's foes when you clearly articulate your thoughts so publicly. In the old days, these kind of things would have only been said in private, and it meant that when there were international crises of various different types, then you would always people would always be second guessing what you were going to do. And I think that one, unfortunately, of President Biden's traits is that he acts more like a pundit than a president. He's a commentator-in-chief rather than a commander-in-chief. And it's not the way that you effectively emanate strength and strategy. And so I think that those are three sort of thoughts as to why I think this matters and why I would agree with Dom that this is a gaffe. But I appreciate the question, Justin, and I hope you won't disagree with me too strongly.
Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Dom, and thank you, Justin, for the question. Do let us know what you thought of that. Can we talk about these negotiations? So Russian and Ukrainian negotiators have begun face-to-face talks in Istanbul. They're hosted by the Turkish President, Erdogan, who's urged them both to put an end to this tragedy. Could we sketch out the negotiating positions of each side? And I'd be interested as well to hear a little bit from you about what do we think is realistic? Where might they start in their negotiations? Where might they drop back to?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that you've got to understand the negotiations have already started. I mean, they start long before anyone gets in the room and studiously avoids shaking hands because of COVID or Novichok or God knows what else is floating about. But so the negotiations have already started. Everything we see through the press and through these public statements, that's all part of the game. But formally, Russia wants Ukraine to drop any hope of joining NATO. They've talked about denazification. They want to come to a conclusion in the Donbass, and they want to ensure Ukraine to formally renounce any claim over Crimea. Now, Ukraine wants security guarantees, part of any deal, quite what that would look like and who the guarantors would be, and has pushed back on this idea of reducing its military power, but has signalled that it's willing to at least shelve for a short time or some amount of time this idea of joining NATO. So there are some areas where they can touch. The biggie is going to be territory, I think. Once you start fighting, it's incredibly hard for in this case, Ukraine, to relinquish any amount of gains, any amount of land that you've lost to the other side. I mean, it would be seen. It would be a victory for Putin. He's a man who doesn't actually care about the numbers, the loss of life. So he would just see a win. He wouldn't see a Pyrrhic victory. He would just take the victory. So I think it is going to be incredibly difficult, that talk. Issues about the Donbass will be very interesting, because before the war, the separatist areas in the east of the country was the relationship between Kyiv and those areas was strained to the point of breaking point, if indeed they still survived. So, I mean, there was room there to do something, to have some quasi political fudge about the autonomy, or how much autonomy those areas would have, and quite where they sit in the international group of nations. But the territory to the south, that land corridor that looks almost to be complete, if Mariupol finally falls, then that land corridor from mainland Russia through to Crimea up to the Dnieper River will be complete. I think that will be hotly contested, because Russia will not want to give that up. And whatever accommodation, if any, Ukraine's prepared to make over the Donbass, they will not want any inch of that ground along the south coast to be ceded. So I think there are some absolutely fundamental sticking points here, even if there has been signalling over some of the other bigger issues.
If I could just add to that, I think it's important to stress as well that it's not just Russia and Ukraine that are at this negotiation table. They may not be there in person, but in spirit, of course, many of the Western powers will be talking to both sides and making their own positions very clear. And as I say, we have reported and had heard in the last sort of 24 hours or so that, as I say, the British position is saying to Zelensky, and I say this is just rumours, but that the British position is saying to Zelensky that, you know, you shouldn't be conceding land to Putin, and of course that's part of, I would assume, the justification being that I was saying earlier that Britain doesn't feel that Putin should get any sort of semblance of victory from this conflict. But there's different noises coming out of Berlin and Paris. that they are more inclined for there to be some sort of peace negotiation that involves compromises. Why? Well, of course, they are much more reliant, particularly the Germans, on good negotiations and good arrangements with Russia. The Germans mostly being around energy, and the French mostly being around other sort of transactional business ties and things like that. So it is not in their interest, whatever they may be saying publicly in condemnation of Putin's actions. They do not want this war to drag on and on and on and continue to sap at their own economies. I mean, it sounds terrible to say when you're faced with this kind of scale of atrocity on the European soil, but we are facing in Europe a cost of living crisis, in part due to the lockdowns and the economic impact of that, but also due to generally poor stagnation in growth in many European countries. And that is also affected now profoundly by the sanctions and by the energy crisis caused by the Ukraine conflict. And so, you know, a lot of these democratically elected politicians are starting to get rather sweaty under the brow at the thought that that very quickly their own populations are going to get upset when they realise that, you know, their energy bill is going to be going up by 50% or more due to what's going on. So there's a lot of other factors in play here, unfortunately, that will determine any outcome in these negotiations. But as I say, I would argue that the fundamental point surely has to be that whatever one's domestic issues at home, that the fundamental thing that cannot be allowed to be conceded here is that Putin is absolutely in the wrong and cannot be allowed to walk away from this with any semblance of victory.
Thanks both. And these negotiations have started off in quite a hair-raising manner, which I think brings us on to the what we'd like to think of as the main topic of this Spaces and this particular podcast. The Ukrainian delegation have said that, have given themselves advice that they should not eat or drink anything because of a risk of poisoning. And we had an astonishing story report yesterday that Roman Abramovich had been poisoned. Dom and Francis, Dom, I know you had quite a few thoughts on this. What should we make of this? How far can we trust that this is true?
Right. I always wish more people in public discourse would say, I don't know, when asked a question, rather than just pick a line and drill it into the ground. I mean, a large part of what I'm about to say, it comes under the badge of I don't know. It's just so bizarre. There are so many speculations and avenues you could go down. But on the face of it, the open source reporting website Bellingcat produced a report last night saying that on March the 3rd, Roman Abramovich and two Ukrainian negotiators reported having been at a round of negotiations, reported feeling very ill, having very painful eyes, having red and blotchy skin, and they assessed that they'd been poisoned. Now, Bellingcat has said that they've had an independent medical expert examine the individuals in person and can confirm these things. So not just idle speculation. And Bellingcat have shown themselves over the years to be a very good source of information, of accurate information, very well verified, trustworthy information. So on the face of it, I'm inclined to say that I kind of believe Bellingcat. Having said that, it seems such an extraordinary story. And the US administration last night, US officials were saying that they believe that the three individuals could have experienced those symptoms because of, quote, environmental factors. Gave no further information. But quite what the environmental factors are, I don't know. So it is extraordinary what's happened here. So it could be a very short podcast. I could stop here and say, you pay your money, take your choice. We don't know. But let's work on take a working assumption that these negotiations were poisoned in a similar fashion to we saw the use of Novichok in Salisbury in 2018 that made the likely target, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia, very, very ill for a short time, killed a woman, Dawn Sturgis. And of course, you've got Litvinenko about 10 years ago, 2006. I think Litvinenko was killed, polonium-210 used against him in London. So there is form here. Navalny has been poisoned again with Novichok. So let's take it that this is a poisoning. Then have to ask, well, who benefits from it, and where might it have come from? I think most most sophisticated observers would say that if this was the Russian state that did it, that would have to have been done with the acknowledgement, i.e. order, of Vladimir Putin. So the Russian state organs, the British held responsible for Litvinenko and the Sergei Skripal attacks, if it was a Russian state organ, Vladimir Putin would have said yes to that operation. There are other people in the Russian ecosystem who, a bit like in the cyber domain, work with the tacit support of the state, but are not actually part of the state themselves. And a lot of groups, a lot of individuals who work for what they see as their master's voice, or in line with what they think Putin would want, but don't actually take direct communication and direct instruction from him. It's possible that that's happened here, that somebody thought they would be doing Putin a favor by derailing these negotiations, or by striking out at an oligarch, Roman Abramovich, who has a lot of links to Ukraine, a lot of links to the West, and maybe they thought they could either derail the negotiations or send a signal to the other oligarchs, who it's a long shot, but if the oligarchs closest to Putin all got their heads together and said, we are better off with this guy not in power than we currently are, they may be able to unseat him. So this could have been a message to the other oligarchs to say, you're not untouchable. But I come back to my original point. I'm very happy. I'm very to hide behind. I just don't know at the moment. I don't think anyone does, or maybe one or two people do who did it. But there's some speculation there. Very happy to discuss all of that. But not much further than that, I'm afraid.
If I could just jump in there and say a comment on what Don was saying about the reliability of Bellingcat. It's also now been reported, I think they were working in tandem together by the Wall Street Journal, obviously a very highly respected newspaper in the United States, and then subsequently by us and other newspapers around the world. But Bellingcat also were the first journalism outfit to identify the two agents that committed the Salisbury poisonings. So in that sense, they have very, very good pedigree in terms of their research on these matters. Furthermore, I would just go add to what Dom said, in the sense that this is not, whether this was the Russian state or not, we don't know. But if it isn't, then that shouldn't mean that we then say, well, it was that it was that previous incidents of this are somehow unreliable as well. I mean, let's face it, from what we already know, and Dom's given many examples, the Russian state has been engaging in this kind of activity for years. And I think it's important to stress that there's a profound difference between the normal, in inverted commas, means of espionage, which all countries undertake in terms of gathering intelligence, gathering classified information, forwarding it on to foreign powers, etc. But and then political murders and poisonings, which we know that the Russian state is very active in. And one of the big differences between that and other hostile powers who do it is that the Russians have no qualms about doing so publicly, to intimidate and to instill fear in those who may challenge the state at home and abroad. There's a huge difference, I think, between these, as I say, the usual spying activities that are occurring and those of the Russian state. And I think it's right that we call out the Russian state that's been guilty of these things. And I think one could argue that we have not been strong enough in previous years. I mean, we knew what had happened with Alexander Litvinenko. We knew what had happened with the Skripals and the Salisbury poisonings, yet we didn't suspend diplomatic relations with Russia. We didn't close the Russian embassy. We've continued until now in this current conflict to house and home Russian oligarchs' money here in London, and as have many other countries around the world. And as I say, this has only arguably strengthened the Russian resolve to continue such attacks. So whether this is the reality of what has occurred here, I think is secondary to this fundamental point that whether this one is real or not, there are numerous other examples that one can point to. And the FSB is an enormous organisation as well. It's got 66,000 uniformed staff and about 4,000 special special forces. It's an enormous security outfit, and so it is no wonder they are partaking in so many operations around the world, such as the ones that I've just described.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Dom. I think your the ability to look at it and say, I don't know, is very important. I can imagine that's extremely useful to our listeners. I'd like to ask a little bit more, since we're talking about espionage, about how it's worked in this conflict. What's your take on the strength of the espionage on both sides?
Well, the first point I'd make is from the West, so outside of Ukraine, but the Western intelligence agencies, I'm principally talking British and American, and they were remarkably close to the money in their assessment prior to the invasion, much more so than most other commentators in government or in the media. So they got that bit right. And since the war has gone on, certainly from the British side, we've seen Defence Intelligence, which is part of the Ministry of Defence, have a big role to play. Defence Intelligence is about 5,000 people. It's a big old chunk of the UK defence infrastructure, part of Strategic Command, but it owns so Defence Intelligence owns the Special Forces Group. It owns all the stuff up at RF Witten, all the satellite stuff and other sort of SIGINT and so signals intelligence, measurements and signatures intelligence, etc., etc. So for example, when North Korea fires a missile and we get information through satellites that say, oh yeah, there's a missile plume of this magnitude at this location, we assess it to be a missile launch. That comes from Defence Intelligence. So they've got all sorts of stuff to work with, and so a lot of the information that's received, of course, intelligence, let's not forget, is information plus assessment. One of the small hills I will die on is that there's nothing in the world. Intelligence information does not exist. Intelligence is information plus assessment. So there's the getting it, and then there's the analysing it, and then it's passed to policymakers, which is why you should always keep politicians well out of the way of the actual raising of intelligence, because that can properly muddy the waters. But that's a podcast series all in its own right. But the point I'm making is Defence Intelligence now has a lot of the eyes on this area and are able to feed in ground truth and sensible assessment of what's likely to happen in the near term, i.e. out to the next sort of 24, 48 hours, and then days ahead of that, so out to about a week. Anything more than that, and it's pretty much guesswork at the moment. But the traditional espionage agencies in this country, so MI6, the overseas agency, and in the US structures, the CIA, kind of taking a bit of a back seat now. That their time has passed and will come again. But at the moment, it's the satellites, it's the airborne platforms, it's the ground platforms, which include individuals. It's those sensors drawing in information, passing on to a body of people who analyse it, of course, greatly helped these days through artificial intelligence to crunch through data, analyse it, and then come up with intelligence to pass on to the policymakers upon which to decide.
It's been very interesting, I think, just to add into what Don was saying, the for all of the successes of Western intelligence, I don't think anyone really believed just how wrong the Russian intelligence could be. It has been staggering seeing the extent to which, from the information that we've had sort of leaking out in the last few weeks, the extent to which Putin seemed absolutely convinced that parts of Ukraine would be treating the occupying soldiers as liberators, that this would be a very, very short war indeed, perhaps a matter of days, perhaps only a week or two, that Kiev would be taken very quickly, hence why there was such a rush to try and seize the capital early on. All of these fundamental beliefs have been proven grossly inaccurate. And so I think it's just worth underlining that whilst Western intelligence has been very accurate, the Russian intelligence has also been highly inaccurate. And of course, that's played a very major role. Just to one final thought based on something that Don was just saying there about intelligence and politicians not getting too involved with it. It's one of the mantras of intelligence that one should never ask from the intelligence services for a justification for something that you already believe. And I think that's exactly what Putin has done. He would have said to his intelligence services, I believe that Ukraine is sympathetic to us. Prove it to me. And so inevitably in that situation, the intelligence he would have received or would have been formulated around that. And we've seen, of course, miscalculations in a similar way in the West, perhaps around weapons of mass destruction. Both the American and British administrations believed absolutely that those weapons were there regardless of the intelligence that came back. And that is a political decision as much as it is an intelligence one. And of course, there are numerous examples of that in the First and Second World Wars as well, where intelligence was pointing in one direction, but the political desire was for it to go another way, and that the intelligence that came back, or was in, or the intelligence that was then later interpreted, was seen in a different light. And so I think that this is a classic case and a casebook example of that, and one that will inevitably in the decades after this conflict be studied in detail of how it is possible for one's intelligence to be quite as wrong as clearly the Russians was and is.
Just to make another point, so we've spoken here before about the Russian military chain and how the units at the tactical end of that very rarely can use initiative or get themselves out of a sticky situation by thinking on their feet, because they're just not culturally trained to do that as an army. Everything is referred back up the chain for decision at the top. And it seems to be very similar in the Russian intelligence chain as well, that this idea of groupthink and this idea that, as Francis said, when the boss says, I think they're going to do this, can you find me the evidence for it? Or just by implying, I think they're going to do this, they naturally fall into line to go and sort of either make up stuff or put too heavy an interpretation on it to please the boss. And that is where groupthink is most dangerous. And intelligence agencies, now that they're sort of coming out of the shadows a little bit in the last few years and are openly recruiting in our newspapers and putting it on YouTube and what have you, they are really pushing the desire, making it very clear that they want to attract people from all walks of life. Now, of course, they always say this, and it makes sense to try and get as many people applying as possible. But in this country, and I'd be very interested to hear from our US colleagues again, but in this country, GCHQ, our signals intelligence organization, are really looking for people from a neurodiverse background, simply because they want to get as far away from that idea of groupthink as possible. So have people who think differently, not only because they've been trained to, but actually because of us all being different individuals. If you have people who think differently anyway and come to life and come to problems from a slightly different angle, that can only be helpful if they then are also given the tools of the trade. But if they are coming at it from a person from a different angle, that gets you away from this idea, this risk of groupthink, such that you end up invading a wrong country or invading a country for all the wrong reasons.
I think it's worth as well just making the point that, of course, this is doubly humiliating for Putin because he is of an intelligence background, formerly the KGB, but many of those who are part of his regime were former colleagues in that enterprise, and he prides himself on the work that he has done to modernise and reform the modern day equivalent of the organisation that he used to work for, the FSB. So this is clearly something, of course, we've not heard this from him himself, but you can imagine the kind of conversations that are taking place in the Kremlin around these failures. This will be something that really he will not be best pleased about, and I think that I would not be surprised if once this is all over, we see yet another radical overhaul of the FSB and those that are currently leading it. Not that we necessarily know their names, but I'm sure that we will hear through our sources of things going on there, because I think it's inevitable after this embarrassment.
Francis, you took the question right out of my mouth, so thanks. I'd just like to add one more thing to that, and just Francis and Dom, you'll see if my theory is worth anything. But as you said, Francis, Putin's career starts in the KGB and the FSB, and he's relatively close. I forget how close, but he's relatively close to the Oleg Gordievsky case. And now, sort of 30 years later, he's in the process of being bested once again by Western intelligence services. I wonder how much you think that might weigh on his mind.
Well, I can imagine it being something that is on his mind. Oleg Gordievsky, for those listeners who are not familiar, was the most significant Russian agent to defect to the West. But prior to him doing so, he was feeding invaluable intelligence to MI6 that was going right to the top, not only of the British government in the form of then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, but that she herself was then feeding that into Ronald Reagan about the state of the Russian mentality. And we've talked before, I remember in one of the very early episodes of this podcast about in the 1980s, at the time that this was going on, it was firmly believed in the West, wrongly, that Russia was really winding down any prospect of a nuclear escalation with the West. But actually, as Oleg Gordievsky was able to prove definitively, that quite the opposite was taking place, that the Russian people were firmly the Russian intelligence services were firmly of the belief that there was that a nuclear strike a preeminent nuclear strike on the part of the Western powers may well be imminent, and they had prepared for what they would do in response to that. And this clearly meant that there had to be an adaptation to cool things down from the Western intelligence services, which was highly significant. And some people argue that we came closer to nuclear war in the 1980s, and 1983 particularly, than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another piece of valuable intelligence that Oleg Gordievsky was able to feed through was about Gorbachev and the role of other people outside of the current regime in charge of Russia at the time, to make clear that actually that there were people who were contesting the old-fashioned Bolshevik ideology, particularly around the economy and armaments and of sending in troops. And that information ultimately led to Margaret Thatcher famously saying that Gorbachev was somebody of which the West could do business with. So a hugely invaluable source of intelligence, and such is his notoriety and significance, that he, to this day, is believed to be a target of the Russian intelligence services, and he has to live in a safe house in the United Kingdom. So his case is absolutely fascinating and a true hero in the battle for freedom. But it only underlines the significance of intelligence and how it can play a role in ways that only truly one can understand many decades later.
Yeah, and for my money, will Putin take this personally? Will he feel as if it's his own intelligence failure, given his background in the KGB? No, don't think so. He's already got his defense in early. We saw that extraordinary National Security Council meeting in Moscow just before, I think, 2 days before the start of the war, where Putin publicly embarrassed Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the SVR. Had him up behind the podium and was asking him all sorts of awkward questions and just humiliated him. That might be because Naryshkin had made some comments about the Donbass and how there might be room for some sort of maneuver there in terms of negotiating. But Putin was very quick to just chop the guy off at the knees, maybe literally now, but. Yeah, so I think it went in the wash up such that there'll be in the Kremlin, this intelligence failure will be placed firmly at the door of the spooks and Naryshkin in particular, I would imagine, and it would be absolutely nothing to do with Putin in his reading of it.
Well, thank you, Dom and Francis, for that quite fascinating discussion. Dom, just a very, very quick question from me, and I know you can't speak too much on this, but as a former soldier, how do you actually work with intelligence? How does it sort of come to you? How do you react to it?
So, intelligence from the intelligence agencies, it annoyingly doesn't come in sort of buff brown envelopes slipped under your door at midnight. It comes in at much higher up the military chain. There's where the civil and military organs meet, and it will be fed in fed in that way. And so, I mean, the military do work alongside and sometimes with intelligence agencies. There are liaison officers within the British intelligence infrastructure from serving military and vice versa, and so there's a very clear link there. But it's a constant sort of conversation, really, rather than just it suddenly appears and the whole of the military want to go left flanking, and then the fella at the back of the room wearing the Mac says, "No, I'd go right flanking." It doesn't quite work like that. It's much more joined up at a much earlier stage, and it normally it's kept well out of sight of the sort of divisions and brigades and what have you. It happens at a much higher level than that. But there's the organisations are very very firmly knitted together, albeit in small numbers. But there are established practices. It's all cleared legally and constitutionally in the UK system, and when military action that may be using or reliant upon, or in some way involving intelligence from the civil agencies, is involved, then there's a whole host of established procedure and policy so that it is legally compliant, and you're not going to end up, for example, with military people going into harm's way and potentially taking life based on the say-so of a civilian outside of a very strict and tried and tested legal construct.
If I could just add to that, I remember going to a talk and speaking to Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, afterwards, and he made the point that Dom has just made very, very strongly, which is, I think, going against the stereotypes of the intelligence services, that we think that they operate in the shadows and in the legal grey zone. But the reality is very, very different, that almost everything that is done is done through very, very strict legal procedures in the West. And that is something, of course, that is not the case with the Russian FSB and their other intelligence agencies, and I think that that's something of which we can be very proud, in contrast to the actions of the Russian state.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Dom. I think we're coming to the end of this. Very quickly, what should we be looking for in the days ahead, especially thinking about the negotiations?
Well, I think it's just been breaking in the last half hour that Russia has rode back. A further road back on these on the earlier position of the war, saying it's going to make a quote unquote radical reduction in attacks on Kyiv. It says it's going to be doing this in conjunction with the meaningful talks in Turkey, and also as a way of redeploying forces to the east. But yet again, it's another step back for Russia, which I think can only be a good thing. Those big caveats are out there about what happens to the Donbass, what happens to the south of the country, but they are good signs. Long way to go, but good signs. So I'd keep an eye on the not only what's happening in Turkey, but also these signals coming out of Moscow. And
I would just stress that the point that we were making earlier on and have made previously, that from the Ukrainian perspective, whilst at the moment it would appear that President Zelensky is in a very, very strong position, we shouldn't forget that he is still faced with a possibility of a renewed and fiercer Russian engagement. These negotiations may well be a Russian strategy whilst they rebuild their capabilities, buying them time, etc. So he's got that on his mind. Obviously, already the devastation wrought by the Russian onslaught, and also these issues around, is there, which we've spoken about before. He's now got a population that, whilst very much unified by him, if he concedes certain things or doesn't concede certain things, there is a probability that you've got a very highly armed population, that Ukraine will potentially be destabilized further and could even be threatened by some kind of civil war or activities that would require a sort of inner strife or reaction to that. So whilst President Zelensky is in a very strong position, I think we should be sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of other things going on that may well be shaping what could be quite a surprising compromise arrangement from our perspective in the West. So I would just be very sensitive to that.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you found this show helpful, follow Ukraine, the latest, on your podcast app. And if there's something we could do to make it even more useful, do let us know. You can email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Jaden Irving.